As I mentioned, we are still working through the book of Esther together, and so we are now into chapter 8. This is an interesting chapter. We're still in the same subject that we picked up last week. Things have not completely resolved, and so there is still some measure of unfinished business to take care of. You might remember last week, Haman was hanged, and we were reminded of this theme through that passage, Romans 12, verse 19. As we read this morning already, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. This is an important principle of the New Testament. Certainly as believers, as Christians, we are never to be vengeful and take revenge because we trust God for being the perfect judge that he is to deal with all things. We began to see that theme last week. We saw this in Proverbs 26-27 as Haman began this great event of trying to roll the stone over top of the Jewish people. It rolled back on him. Whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. When you begin to do something dastardly, tables turn and it rolls back on you. That is the proverb that certainly fits with Haman's life. So we began to see that theme. We'll take that up again this week. I don't know if you're familiar with the name Sir Robert Watson Watt. He was the man who invented radar. During the Second World War, he was clearly the man of the hour, and could come up with a device for seeing planes, being able to see through clouds and being able to see the enemy coming and the like. In 1954, he was traveling in Canada, and he got a speeding ticket. He was pulled over by a policeman with, wait for it, a radar gun. The irony, he who rolls a pit, digs a pit, he'll fall into it. He wrote a poem about his little event. I called it Rough Justice. Pity Sir Robert Watson Watt, strange target of this radar plot, and thus with others I can mention the victim of his own invention. His magical all-seeing eye enabled cloud-bound planes to fly, but now by some ironic twist it spots the speeding motorist and bites, no doubt with legal wit, the hand that once created it. Sir Watson Watt dug a hole, fell into it. I mean, in a manner of speaking. It wasn't his intention, but that's what happened. And there's a strange thing that can take place with regard to this whole subject of vengeance, and this whole subject of retribution, this whole subject of justice. This morning, if I'm going to give a title to anything, it is simply The Reversal. That may seem like a strange title, but I think by the end, this will begin to make sense. And in fact, the book of Esther folds in on itself and reverses, and I'll explain what I mean by that as we look at this. But ultimately, what we see is the hand of justice of an unseen God who deals with his enemies and undoes the undoable. Esther chapter 8, verses 1 to 16. We are a people who want closure. We want justice. We want to see things come to a right and proper conclusion. It's just who we are. We do this even in our fiction. There was an article in Wall Street Journal some years ago. It was written regarding Sarah Colton, who was, at the time, an executive producer of a television program which I know nothing of and I'm not advocating for, but it was a program called Dexter. I'm just giving you the information. I'm not trying to sound like I'm promoting anything. This is a quote by her. She was obviously involved at great length with this television production with all these characters. Whether you want to call it retribution, which is slightly too biblical for my taste, there is some need for moral judgment that accumulates with these characters which they cannot escape. There's a need for these characters to come to their just end. If the viewers want to be satisfied, if they want to enjoy the story, then there comes a point, she's saying, where even the people that we begin to, even though they're fictional, we have to do away with them. We have to put them in prison. We have to give them their just desserts. If we're going to satisfy the viewer, there has to come a point where they receive what they deserve. They receive the moral judgment that has accumulated on them. We need closure. This is one of the reasons that Lost was so controversial when it finished its season, 6 seasons of Lost. I don't know if you watched this series. Again, I'm not advocating for it, but the last episode of the last series left everybody so confused, they were angry. I've wasted my life watching this program, and now I still don't know what happened. That seemed to have this nebulous kind of, there are websites and blogs that are dedicated to explaining Lost, because people were lost while they tried to watch this program, and they reached the conclusion and they were frustrated. Why? Because there was no bow. There was no justice. There was no conclusion. We are a people that hunger for resolution. We are a people that want to have justice that is fair and right. We want closure. This is who we are. This is one of the reasons that we find cold cases so frustrating. It's a headline of a newspaper, January 1966, Adelaide, Australia. 3 children given bus money to go down to the beach. There are eyewitnesses who see these children at the beach. They see them in line at the food kiosk. There are witnesses who saw them gathering their things to come home, but they never made it home. And to this day, these parents do not know where their children went. They literally seem to have vanished off the planet. Some of you would be the exact age of these children today. Maybe if you grew up with an accent and you think you were adopted, maybe this is not funny, I shouldn't say that. But they're missing. And this is frustrating. These parents want closure. They want an answer. They want justice. These children deserve justice. They've been snatched from their family. What do you do with a case where there is no closure? We hunger for it. Well, chapter 8 has the same dilemma. There is a dilemma that there is a problem that the Jewish people are going to be eradicated. The law still stands. Haman has had his way, and the law has been written and signed with the king's signet ring. And Esther has now been granted a higher position. Let's begin at verse 1. On that day, what day? It's the day that Haman was hanged. Haman's dead, and now, without wasting any time at all, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. The reason for this is because he is now the authority over his property. Persian law dictated that when a criminal pays the penalty, whatever that penalty is, his property is seized by the crown. And the crown is then at liberty to do with that property and goods whatever they wish. And so the king decides to give the property of Haman to Queen Esther. Oh, the ironic twist. The enemy of the Jews his property is now owned by a Jew. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. Can you imagine this day for King Ahasuerus? He didn't know his wife was a Jew. He didn't know she was related to Mordecai. He didn't know that when Mordecai, who was the one who saved his life, had somehow been privy to all that's going on to get Esther to come before the king and the whole story, he probably was just sitting down dumbfounded at what was going on and putting all the pieces together on who his wife is and what her background is and who he's related to and all the rest. Mordecai came before the king. Esther had told him what he was to her, and the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. The great reversal. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She recognizes that there's still this unfinished business. There's something that's still hanging. There's an injustice that still can't be fixed. There has been a law made that the Jews are going to be annihilated. So Esther speaks to the king again. She fell at his feet. There's a bit of drama here. I'm sure this is not acting. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded. Now, I know that sounds really very dramatic. Let me ask you something. Have you ever in your life fallen at somebody's feet and wept and pleaded? Imagine, I've never been in that state. Imagine the emotional state that would bring you to a place where this has to be the only thing you desire. You hunger this one thing more than anything else, that your physical reaction is to throw yourself prostrate and begin weeping and pleading your case. I would rather die, in essence, is what you're saying. I need this thing. She pleaded with him to avert the plan of Haman, the Agagite. He's mentioned as the Agagite. It's the enemy of the Jews. You remember that goes back to 1 Samuel 15. We'll not retrace our steps again. But this is a phrase that reminds us, that goes all the way back to the Amalekites. He is of the clan of those who have been against the Jews through all time. He is Haman the Agagite, and the plot that he devised against the Jews. She begins to plead with him. But the king, regardless of her pleas, can do nothing. The law has been set in place. It doesn't matter her emotional state. It makes no difference that she has a physical reaction in hungering for a change. The law cannot be removed. When the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king and said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in your sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleased in his eyes." Did you hear that? Do you hear how she's building her case? That if anything, if you could just please, if there's any way, if there's any loophole, if there's anything you can think of, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. There's got to be something you can do. There's an aspect to this. Although King Ahasuerus is not representative of the king, he's not representative of God the king, there's certainly a principle that overlaps here. It's a principle of how laws are written. God has written his moral law, and it doesn't make any difference how you feel when you wish to get out from under that moral law. That moral law will not be moved. It cannot be changed. And it doesn't matter how you plead or how you feel or what your emotional state is, you are born under that moral law, and it doesn't move. So when the moral law says that you have to be moral in all of your thinking, in all of your actions, that means you are immediately guilty the moment you pass by a hitchhiker at the side of the road and find your mind wandering into these filthy ideas. Every time your eyes glimpse at something that you shouldn't glimpse at as a married man or woman, and your thoughts come to a place you shouldn't, you're immediately against the moral law. Every time the moral law says you must tell the truth all the time, but you pick up the telephone and you can't help but just fudge a little bit that you don't want to have to go, and you don't want to, so you make up an excuse, a half excuse. It's not really true, but you don't want to have to go to this party. You don't want to be involved in this situation. You come up with a reason. It's not a real reason, but it's good enough reason. And you barefaced lie. You tell yourself it's not a lie, it's all for the best. You lie to yourself that you didn't lie. You can't even keep the law. You are bound under this moral law. You are born under this moral law. You are given a moral edict how you are to live as God's subject. But you don't even care about this law. You know it in your heart, but you tramp on it. You walk on it. You make your own rules. You call yourself God. Our society has come to a place where they believe that God is a trivial thing, that he matters not at all. He's just a made-up idea, a human concept. And so we tramp on his law, and we walk over his moral character, and we walk into his presence, and we believe that somehow, that when we die, that somehow we could plead a case. Oh, I know, but I've been a good person. I've never been to prison. I've never done anything wrong. I never did drugs. I never really sold drugs. Well, okay, maybe one time. I never really did anything that hurt anybody. And we've got all of our excuses and all of our reasons, and you could plead your case. But you have a problem because there is a moral code that has nothing to do with your emotional feelings. There's a moral code that falls on you that is above whatever your thoughts are about yourself. The moral law will be measured against your moral conduct, and you're caught. If you were to be honest with yourself, you are in a serious spiritual state. There is no escape. You are born under the moral law, you have broken the moral law, and it doesn't matter what your pleading is. It doesn't matter how much you beg. You are going to die. That's the state that Esther is in. Her pleading, her calling, all of her begging, she is going to die. There is a picture, if you will, a gospel picture of how we are born in this moral state. How can I, Esther says, how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Oh, can't you show some mercy? How can I watch this? The king is like, Esther, you're not getting this. It's really got nothing to do with how you feel, and I know you're going to feel sad, and I know you're going to be unhappy, and I know it's going to hurt your feelings. There's nothing going to be done. The law must be written, the law must be followed through, and the justice of the law will be met. There's no turning back. No turning back. The king answered to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. What's he saying? That's as far as I can go. That's the justice I can give you. I did my part. I've done everything I can do. Haman is dead, and I gave him your land. My hands are tied. The law has been written. The law has been set in place. The Jews will be annihilated. There's no undoing this. It is going to happen. But, he says, you may write as you please. With regard to the Jews, I gave Mordecai the signet ring. A law could be written. You may write as you please in regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. Why don't you write a second law? And if you write a second law that overcomes the first law, you will have a way out. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And so an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps, the governors, the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in his own script, and to each people in his own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. Whoever takes a human life, Leviticus 24:17-20, whoever takes a human life shall be put to death. You know, we read this edict in Esther and we think that's really harsh. So these people are now allowed to kill anybody who comes to them. But really it is pure, justifiable retribution. It is an eye for an eye. That is the law of the Old Testament. Whoever takes a human life shall be put to death. The new law that was written was simply a law that said if someone attacks you with lethal force, you have the legal right now to respond to them with legal force. It was not giving them permission to go off nilly-willy and just kill whoever you want. It was an edict that allowed them now to put death to death. If someone came to kill them, they could defend themselves legally, and they could put them to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good. Life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor and he has done it, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. The punishment must be equal to the crime. That's the principle of this text. The punishment must be equal to the crime. The punishment must be equal to the crime. Not exceed it, not go beyond it. It has to be exact. Justice must be served with precision. The punishment must exactly meet the crime. An eye for an eye. This didn't mean necessarily literally that you would scoop somebody's eye out. It was a means of making sure that every response was justified. I'm just emphasizing this for dramatic effect. We're going to pick up this theme in a few moments. An eye for an eye. Tooth for a tooth. And that's the law. They can now respond to their enemies with the new edict now allows them to respond and save their own lives. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Now, just by way of literary device, I want to show you what's going on. This is a bit of a side trail. Let's take a little bit of a scenic overlook here at the book, and I want you to see chapter 3 and chapter 8, because there are two laws, and the way that they are written and recorded in this book is intentional for the reader to follow, that there's symmetry to this. Okay, just so you understand how the book is put together, and that what they've done with the second law is exactly what was done with the first law. This is how it reads. In chapter 3, the king's scribes were summoned. Chapter 8, the king's scribes were summoned. You didn't write your own law. It had to be by the king's scribes. In chapter 3, it is sent to every province. In chapter 8, it is recorded it's sent to every province, which is 127 provinces. In chapter 3, it's recorded that the edict went out and was delivered in every language. It is made sure that the exact edict is made and delivered in chapter 8 in every language. Chapter 3, it is sealed with the king's signet ring. In chapter 8, the same thing happens. The new law is sealed with the king's signet ring. It is delivered by the king's couriers in chapter 3, and in chapter 8, it is also delivered by the king's couriers. The law in chapter 3 gives instructions to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews. Chapter 8 gives permission to destroy, kill, and annihilate the enemies of the Jews. 3, the edict said they had permission was granted to plunder their goods, and in chapter 8, permission was granted to plunder their goods. And again, this falls under the same law of Haman's property being taken by the king. If you were an enemy of the crown, your goods and property were taken. The Jews are given that authority. If this enemy comes against you, the crown gives you their property by virtue of them coming on you as an enemy. So these two edicts are written back to back and made sure to be clear to every person. So here's the second law. Let's keep reading. There's a reversal that takes place here. Verse 15. Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Does this sound reflective of anything you remember from the book of Esther? You might remember chapter 4, that in fact, well, now he goes out in royal robes. In chapter 4, verse 1, Mordecai was once dressed in sackcloth and ashes. And you might remember, as we just read at the end of this text, that the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The law goes out, the city shouts and rejoices. You might remember the first law went out in chapter 3. The law went out, and the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. There is bookends that take place. The book of Esther folds in on itself, and all of the events that took place in the first 5 chapters or 7 chapters are now reversing themselves and coming back in a complete opposite way. Verse 16 of chapter 8, these are strange words. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. Do you remember what happened in chapter 4? In every province where the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and lamenting. This is not how they were. This is not light and gladness and joy and honor. This is the opposite. Things have reversed. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. Man, that's cool. No school, banks closed, everybody, don't go to work. It's a holiday. Get together with your family, go kill a turkey, whatever you do, whatever your holiday thing is in the ancient Near East, and give presents to each other. This became, in essence, Christmas. There's a new law been written. There's a new hope on the horizon. There's a new way to get out from under the first law. There's a second covenant that's been made. There's a way now that we can have the first law and the requirements of the first law dealt with. There's a way now that we can deal with the first law that we can't get out from under, that we are born in and without any escape. This is a reason to celebrate. It's like we should maybe have Christmas or something. Let's make this a really big deal, because there is a way that we can have the first law satisfied. Many of the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. The Jewish people had a reason to celebrate. The second law gave them a way to get out from under the first law. Can you not see the gospel here, people? This is why we celebrate the cross. There is a substitute that's been given to us that meets the righteous requirement of the moral code. The one that we can never meet, the one that we will never satisfy, the one that we fail at every day. Do you know the first commandment? Have no other gods but me. How many times today have you broken that commandment? You haven't even thought about God more than whatever time you're in church. I'm talking about myself. I mean, you get out of bed, you're thinking about breakfast and a shower, and your eyebrows need to be trimmed, or whatever's going on with your crazy hair, and it's growing out all over the place because you're ages and you don't understand what's happening. You're thinking about everything else in the world, but your devotion and your heart is not woken up to say, glory be to God. May God be glorified in my life. I'm just surmising that's highly likely to be true. Maybe it's not. The first commandment, you didn't even consider that you have broken it before you even get your feet out of bed. You live breaking the moral code. What are you going to do about it, people? You're caught. The moral code will not be undone. And you have made other gods in your life. If it's not your bowling ball, it's your car, your yacht, your bank account, your family, your vacation, whatever. You love stuff more than God. Guess you're in trouble. Guess I'm in trouble. Thanks be to God. He wrote a second law. He wrote a second covenant. He provided a means of his own choice to satisfy the need for justice. He gives us closure. Though we cannot meet the requirement of the law, it is met in somebody else. He becomes our substitute. He becomes the means by which this law is satisfied. We are now in him by faith. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake he made him to be sin, who knew no sin, that in him we might become the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God. Not your righteousness, not your effort to become righteous. The holiness of God is now accredited to your account if you are found in Christ. If he is your substitute, the punishment of the first law still exists, and it will exist, and somebody will pay it, But you could have allowed Christ to have satisfied that law for you, or you will pay to the satisfaction of that law for yourself. Sounds harsh, but that's what the scriptures teach. The law cannot be repealed, and something must happen that justice comes on all those who disobey the law. You're either found in the one who has paid your debt, or you owe that moral debt to God and you will pay it yourself. That's the scriptures. This is why we celebrate. This is why we have Christmas, people, because we're recognizing God has done something. I just, again, a little bit of a sidetrack, but I want you to see how this book, as I mentioned, folds back on itself. It's just an interesting literary device that you kind of don't see necessarily when you read quickly. Let me just give you some of the major events that take place in the book of Esther. From chapter 3 to chapter 5, the king gives Haman his ring. Haman summons the king's scribes. The letters are written and sealed. The Jews are to be killed. Haman's decree is publicly displayed. The couriers go out. The city of Susa is bewildered. Mordecai wears sackcloth. Mordecai goes through the city lamenting and crying. Zeresh advises Mordecai's death. And now the book from chapter 6 on reverses. The entire story reverses. Zeresh once advised Mordecai's death, and now Zeresh predicts Haman's death just a few verses later. Where Mordecai once went through the city lamenting and crying, Mordecai now goes through the city with honor, riding on the back of the king's horse. Where the city of where Mordecai once wore sackcloth and ashes, he is now clothed with the king's robes, and he wears the royal robes of the king. Where the city of Susa was once bewildered, the city of Susa is now rejoicing that there's a second edict and a way out from under the first edict, which cannot be and will not be repealed. The couriers went out in haste. The couriers also go out in haste. Haman's decree is publicly displayed as law. Mordecai's decree is publicly displayed as law. All the Jews are to be killed in one day. And now all the enemies of the Jews are to be killed in one day. Letters are written and sealed with the king's ring. And the second edict, the letters are written and sealed with the king's ring. Haman summons the king's scribes. Mordecai summons the king's scribes. The king gives Haman his ring and honors Haman. The king gives Mordecai his ring and honors Mordecai. The whole book is written as a mirror of itself. It hinges in the center, and it folds back as a glorified reversal. And do you know what we see in this? It doesn't matter that evil has the upper hand. It doesn't matter that injustice is not fully complete right now. It doesn't matter that there are cold cases that have never received justice. It matters on some human level. But in the ultimate level, there is a judge who will reverse all evil. This is the great truth that we cling to as believers, that all things will one day be ultimately reversed. Yes, right now it seems that evil has the upper hand. Right now it seems that God is relegated to some second-class citizen, if not third or fourth-class citizen in our society. Yes, it seems that the whole concept of loving and obeying and serving God and basing our society on Christian moral values, it seems to be gone as a byword, as an old idea. Yes, it seems like evil is triumphing over and over with a new law and another way of thinking, more morality decay, and it seems like constantly we're being overwhelmed. But don't you understand? The book of Esther shows us what's ultimately going to happen, the ultimate reversal of all things. Evil will collapse in on itself, and every step that evil has taken forward will be turned around and be reversed, and ultimately there will be a day. And I know this is a day we may never see in ourselves in this life, but we are clinging to the hope of a day when all things will be made right. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. The day of the Lord will come like a thief. It'll come like a thief because you don't plan for a thief, and a thief comes to steal and pillage and destroy. There's a sense of double edge to that. The day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar. The heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Well, what is this talking about? It's the uncreation of creation. Everything, all of creation folds back on itself and collapses and is uncreated. Everything reverses, and we get the whole dissolution of the entire universe, we're told. One day justice will reign to such a degree that this universe that has been corrupted by sin will have to be completely eradicated. We'll have to go back down to nothing. And then verse 11, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his promise, we are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Not wickedness, not evil reigns. The great reversal is what we're looking for. This is the closure we are promised as believers. That although we may never have absolute justice in this life, there is coming a day of absolute justice. So much so that those people who have not been found in Christ will find the law applied to their moral state. We open the service with these verses. Let me close the service with these verses. Revelation 22, verses 12 and 13. Behold, I am coming soon, bringing my recompense with me to repay everyone for what he has done. You read this and it sounds, oh, this is so ominous and threatening. It's hellfire and brimstone. No, people, it's justice. That's all he's saying. It's just justice. It's bare-faced, honest, beautiful justice. I'm going to come back, and whatever this negative has to be, it's going to be, you're going to receive the requirements that satisfy the moral requirements of the law. If you've broken the law, justice is waiting for you. The wages of sin is death. That's not a threat. That's not hellfire and brimstone. That's justice. Beautiful, sweet justice. Bringing my recompense with me to repay everyone for what he has done. I am the Alpha and the Omega. The first, I started this, I'm going to end this. I started this world, evil has had its day, it's going to reverse itself, and it's going to be a place of righteousness and truth. And everyone will receive what is due to them. I am the beginning and the end. Let me just read this verse to you. Justice. Blessed are those who wash their robes. This is Revelation, it's talking about salvation. Let me read this again. Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life, that they may enter the city by the gates. Outside are the dogs and sorcerers and the sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. Why are they outside the gate? Because they love to be outside the gate. They don't love Christ's righteousness. They don't love the thought of finding a Savior. They love practicing their immorality. So that leaves you with one question this morning. It's a simple one, but as we gather around the table, I would just ask you to search your own heart. Do you know Christ as the one who's paid your penalty? Do you know Christ as one who's paid your debt? Or are you one who just hopes that's the case? Are you one who's willing to plead your case before God and somehow think that your emotional state is somehow going to undo the fact that you were born under a moral law that you have failed to keep? Christ must be your Savior.